hear my microphone, so I assume it's fine. Otherwise, I speak a little louder. Thanks so much, Thor. And like a round of applause to Aris for getting this all together. I mean, organizing a conference is a lot of work. Who does something like that? That's just not fun. So, yeah, I want to rant a little bit. It turns out if you're stuck for 2-3 years and just doing work, like accumulates a lot of anger inside of you. And like, or like a lot of people actually don't know what I normally do for a living. So you might know me for that, the JSConf, like Thor mentioned briefly. But I have a normal job as well. I run a tiny consulting company here in Singapore that helps companies understand the web and wants to help them build excellent web applications that really work for the user. And so I've done that for a few companies in the past, and one that Aris, without really knowing, picked out of my biography was Redmart. So these are some of the clients. And Silver Bullion is the one I currently work for as well, which is the precious metal stuff. We can talk about that later, it's not part of this talk. But Redmart, because he picked it out to label my name on the website, I found very curious, because I didn't tell him to do that. But it was a long time ago, in 2013, we started this project, and you can see that a company cares about web development if they literally put it on t-shirts. So that was the internal project name that we had. Raman, who helped me build some of this, is here too. So that's kind of my claim to fame initially in Singapore, was the original Redmart, you know, the one that people liked before Lazada. Anyway, I'm not going to get into it. So you can follow me here if you like. That's my Twitter. But then what do I want to talk about is state, or what actually should go into state. So there are a few simple things about state. It's the web is essentially a stateful rendering machine in a way, right? Like that's what it developed to with all the projects like React, Vue, Vuex, Redux, whatnot. Like I feel like developers do nothing else but converting a stream of actions into a certain state, like a rendered website, or the other way around, like a stream of user events back, right? And there are myriad ways of doing that, and there are myriad approaches of doing that. Some of them are listed here. I'm not going to go deep into that. There are a lot of opinions about this as well, on what tools to use to do all of that. I'm not going to go deep into that. There's loads of opinions, as long as they are not React. So there's lots of opinions, but then there's obviously also fact, and I want to thank Raman for that insight. If you use spaces, you earn more. That's just science. That's just science. It's old data already from 2017. I don't know how current that is today. Again, 2-3 years, a lot of anger. So I'm going to touch a little bit of bad habits of web developers and what actually should be done. And so whenever you see this slide, that's me sort of cursing. I don't want to actually curse because it's not fun, so I just use slides like that. State management, so really fun. Typically that's where it all starts. You have some kind of information you want to render, and 3 questions you want to answer on the way. What should go into my state? How do I update my state? And where should I persist my state? These are typically what you go through as a web developer, and I would encourage every web developer to really go through these 3 questions whenever they actually do a more ambitious website. Now, did my screen cut out? No, okay. There are a few things, like this is just very basics. What are we doing as web developers? We're taking information, structure, presentation, we punch it all through some kind of script, and then we have a pretty website. Right, we have hopefully done that before. And oftentimes the point of a website is to provide a service or feedback from the customer, so we attach a bunch of user input to it, and they can interact with all of that stuff, and then you get interactivity, and the whole cycle works. And that's actually not quite correct. Correct would be that. So you have the state up here, you have JSX, sorry Evan, up there, CSS on the right, and we throw this all together with some events, and then that's still not quite correct, but at least we have found the state already. So question answered, I hope. In case you were curious, where's my state? It's up there. It's actually more like that. right? So the events update the state. Now, why do I want to talk about that? Web is hard. If you're a bit like me and you get to put your nose into a lot of different code bases on a daily basis, because you have different clients with different backgrounds, and they typically only reach out to me once they realized how complex the web is and they want help with it, you get to see a lot of interesting things. Specifically that the web is actually quite complex. It is maybe the most complex development platform out there. In terms of comparison to native apps or others, we just have a lot more variables to work with because it works on pretty much every platform, on pretty much every device, oftentimes in multiple different browsers that have their own quirks and supports, and there's just so much stuff to deal with. And it's inherently super global. You can't restrict it just to one app store, right? So it's just a lot of complexity. I don't know, do you want to throw some in when you render your initial state? You want to do a website, you want to render some information, show it to the user. What are all the things you want to consider, or you could consider, when you're rendering a website? And this is to wake you up a little bit as well, so feel free to just shout in and say that you're here. I'll start with one pretty obvious, is the information I want to present, right? That's number one. That should go into my state, I think. And then there are lots of others. So if you know any, authentication, right? Am I logged in or not, right? My sort of state of authentication. Do I render a website that's specific to a user, or do I render a generic website for everybody? More, there are lots. Right, so you're very typical web developers then. There's language and culture of your audience. There's obviously the window size, the device size, like responsive design is hopefully something that arrived in everybody's idea of web development. There's input methods like pointer and touch events that could be different based on which devices or audience you're targeting. There's feature support of web browsers. They're all a little different. User agent. Like, that might be important if you actually have a website that's sort of SEO relevant. Somehow the web works different, where we don't fill out an app store profile, but we have to somehow, I don't know, like call on ghosts and other myriad of ways to magically SEO our website so that like robots can understand it better. There's date and time. You know, do people predominantly open your website at night or in the day maybe, or is it something that's actually time critical or relevant because you have a calendar alert app or something like that? There's user location and other situational attributes. Where are they located? Country-wise, maybe there are regulations or other things that you might want to consider when you're building a really ambitious web app. The usability, like accessibility, device-specific limits, features. Now there are folds too. You know, the devices that fold in half, and then you can sort of react to when it's folded and so on. These are things you can consider if you want to. Network condition and speed. And then where do people actually come from? Did they come from Google or from another website? Maybe you want to pick up on that. It's a nice thing to do. And then there are lots of security requirements. If you run anything that allows users to contribute, to not have them put script tags in there so that you're not accidentally including third-party code. And then why did I say, well, you're very typical web developers? Because web developers look at this and are like, yeah, sure. That's the whole point, I'm doing the website. And from here on, it gets a little iffy. Well, like, language culture, it's like English, right? Window size, we start with desktop because mobile we can do later. Then feature support, nobody uses subgrids anyway. User agents is extra cost for that. There's time and day. Let's not get into time zones. User location, other attributes. It's like maybe later because kind of dark mode is kind of cool. User ability. Really? That's so much effort. Then, you know, the device-specific stuff is just, you know, my boss uses an iPhone, so maybe we include the little bar on the bottom in what we do. Network condition and speed, I don't want to get into. Then refer in other context. Really? Security requirements? At least we do HTTPS, right? So, there you go, web development. So, but all those things actually make a difference if you pick them up. And I'll show an example in the end that I've been working on over the last year as well. to just go through why these things are relevant. Okay, step 2. That was just rendering. That was just showing something to the user, right? Now we ask the guy to give us feedback, to interact with our website, and then things just go crazy, because that's where all the mistakes can happen, right? Obviously, we should do this. If you offer a button, no matter if it's a checkout, a form submit, whatever it might be, right? It should do sort of what you expect. And it's very implicit, sort of something that you should know, ask your users about if that's actually working the way they expect it. All the stuff we talked about, well, it's also relevant if you ask users for feedback. If they type a number into the input field, cultures use different decimal points. In Germany, we use commas for that. Here we use dots, right? Makes a difference. Check for type, completeness, formatting, boundaries. Is it within range? All these kind of things. Allow the user to review complicated submissions before they can submit them. Give them feedback if they do something wrong, especially if something goes wrong on your side. And use transitions to increase the context sometimes. It's just really the upper echelon of awesome web experiences if you have that problem. And then we have web developers. Sure. That's so hard. And nope, come on, that's their job, right? That the backend should do all of that stuff. And then review, oh God, no, I have this awesome little tool that immediately tells you that you're wrong the moment you hit one character on your keyboard. Edge cases were not in the Figma design spec. Have you seen it? And then transitions, it's like nobody does that. But at least, please, do this, right? At least a little bit, and then do a little more, and a bit more, and really go through all the edge cases. This is sadly the only way I have found to make web experiences that actually work and feel good to the customer is becoming sort of the customer and going through it and through all the edge cases. And if you do this manually, it's obviously a good start when you're small, but once it becomes really ambitious, you sort of want to have a process around that, and you should use tools, and one of those is Ulicious that I highly recommend. It allows you to essentially write tests in a much more hardy way. It's less fragile because it doesn't rely on CSS path or XPath selectors to find your elements, so it stays more consistent during updates, and just allows you to create sort of like we call it user journey tests or integration tests that test the whole thing as if we were like somebody on the computer. Relatively easy, and it's hosted, so you don't need to bother about running your own infra. But then web developers are like, right? In Singapore, we call this the happy flow, which is the kind of design spec where everything works and the user did everything right. And then you hit the submit button and everything is amazing. And I've tested that and it works, and everything else I don't care. So that's my response to that. But coming back to that, in the end, when the user gives us feedback and shares the input, well, we still have to update the state and do the whole rendering thing over again, right? And then there's that. Where do we put the state? Oh God, I found so many mistakes on people just storing certain bits of information in the wrong bit. Like, we have lots of choices. Where would you persist your state? Contributory. Tell me. Absolutely valid. Absolutely valid. I call it cloud database. Right? More. Where can you store state? Cookies. Awesome. Local storage. Amazing.
Variable.
Memory. Totally. Yeah. Maybe not great anymore. IndexedDB. Oh. Has anybody ever used that? I've not seen any real world finding. If you find some, let me know. But yeah, we start here. Component state, whatever. You might use React, which is a safe bet at this point. Sorry. Component state, big one. Global state, something like Redux that just keeps track of it. It's really cool if you go religious about it and you go from top to end all the way because of all the replay features and all that stuff. It's fun. I find it super cumbersome though, because for every update that you do, you need to touch like 1 million files. Context state, it's more like intermediate between component and global. You can specify a certain area of your website to just be affected by that. It's just not a bad choice for certain things. You can send it to Supabase, I guess. Then sometimes you have sessions on the server side. So you might just want to persist something for a brief period of time. So there might be a different store for that. Then you have the browser session and local storage. Cookies, like we said. This is my favorite. This was the original intent of the internet, was that whatever website you're opening, you can reproduce by taking this URL thing, putting it into a different computer, clicking on it, and you get the same thing. Imagine. You wouldn't believe how broken this is today, because so many people find it so hard on client-side implementations to really reproduce the state from the URL. Super difficult somehow. Browser history. One of my favorites. If you didn't know this, but in the Navigator history management, you can actually store JSON objects. Horrible, don't use it. Unless you want to target Android users, because they have this annoying back button, and they tend to use it whenever they feel like you took over too much screen real estate with something, and then they want to hit that button and make it go away. Really annoying. The browser database IndexedDB. Hey, there's caching. Service workers, offline apps, they can host state. I'm not kidding. Like a hover is technically a state sort of in CSS-ish, right? Like you have some, there are people creating games in CSS. Like, I don't know if anybody has actually proven CSS to be Turing complete yet, but And then, yeah, no. And this is the example I want to get into for the next, wow, I bruised through this, 10 minutes. So, marketplace search. That was, for me, the toughest example that I had. And I mean, Redmart was one example of that, but then recently I got back into it with a property website that I help. They sell, or try to help agents sell properties in Australia. This is what it looks like. You have a lot of things going on. Like, I'll mention a few. You have a multi-location search here, you have filters of sorts, then you have your results, then you have a map, and you can interact with all of that. So there's an enormous amount of state. Some is presentational state, like is the map visible or not, where do we store that? Anybody has an opinion on that? It's like maybe, I would say component or context state. Doesn't need to go into your database, right? Unless you really want to save it as a user preference, then you might send it to the server so it can be restored when the user logs back in. But typically, I would say component or context state is a good bet, right? Then it becomes more interesting. Filters. Ooh. Where do we put that? URL is a good one, but it's actually more like 4 or 5 different situations, depending on what you do. Now, why is marketplace search hard? It's very information dense. You saw there's lots of stuff happening. You have relatively complex presentation, definitely compared to a blog or many other platforms. It's super interactive and dynamic, and you sort of want to do this client side because it gives you this awesome snappiness where things just really happen instead of sending everything to the server and requesting a new state from there. But then it's still SEO relevant, so you sort of also want the server to do the same thing. So you're kind of doing the same thing twice, just to get that ranking. And there's an enormous amount of user perspective on this. My favorite example is the Japanese national living in the US, like having an account, looking at property in Australia with a user preference for New Zealand. This is why when I first opened the code base, very early days, I saw this variable. Oh. It was pretty tough. It's like, okay, what do you mean, right? Like, I'm swearing again. Is that the market you want to look at? Like Australian property or New Zealand property? Is that the location where the user is? Locate, like IP lookup? Or even geo from the browser? Is that the visiting location? Like, sorry, the difference, user location is where the user is residing. like where he lives, and their visiting location is IP location or lat long or whatever. Do you use it to infer the language or culture of the website out of this? Which can make sense sometimes, but doesn't need to. Singapore has like 4 languages just for its location. To infer currency or time zone out of this, which can be really relevant, specifically time zones. If you want to allow people to look like in an auction event for a property in Australia, and they're located not in Australia, you sort of want to show them the auction timing in their time zone, and then it's really important to know where they are. I mean, the browser should definitely give you that setting, but it's just something you have to sort of think about in these marketplace environments when everything starts to be a bit more complicated. Or do you infer the nationality or regulatory stuff? So working with gold and silver, lots of regulation. But here as well, it turns out that in certain countries, it's actually really easy to buy property in Australia. In other countries, you can't actually easily do that because there are no mortgages for it. Or Australia doesn't allow you to. So you might actually want to consider this stuff. And this is all thrown at you before you render a single result in a way, right? So there was one variable name where I sort of felt like scolding whoever implemented this because it doesn't tell me anything. It's like, be more explicit with your naming. Tell me what this is supposed to do. What is this country ISO code used for here? So that I can read more. So being explicit in coding, always a good idea. Then the other thing is the filters. You saw the bedroom, whatever it is, right? And I think when people start, they go out with good intentions and they write filters and they create the control, and it impacts the query on what properties to get from the backend. Fair. And then you realize, well, we actually want to share that with somebody else, and we should also put it in the URL. Also fair. And then you realize, well, we should save this as a user preference, so when the user comes back, he actually sees it again, right? And then you're like, but that's hard, we do it in local storage first. But eventually you add it to the user profile as well, so when the user logs in, it overrides the local storage, right? That means there's a lot of serialization going on here. And specifically with filters, I found it that people underestimate the amount of string serialization that you actually have to do. So filters need to be sort of rendered into so many different ways. Obviously the filter control, where you can click the buttons or sliders or whatever the filter might be, becomes really fancy for location search. Sometimes a breadcrumb, so you can render a nice element somewhere on the side that tells you what the filter is that's currently applied. You can have a simple string. Tell me, how many bedrooms do I want to look for? 2 to 3. To title. Well, it turns out SEO relevant strings sometimes need to be a little different than normal strings, so that's where title would come in. Obviously, you want to send it to the backend at some point, and depending on what lookup service you use, if you have an Elasticsearch or Algolia or so on, you might actually want to serialize it slightly different. So for every sort of backend you need to send this to, you have like a different serialization technique to write the same filter state and make it different query parameters. The query string itself that you write into the URL, just so that you can copy paste the same page to a friend and they can reproduce the same state. Sometimes to path name as well. Like supposedly certain search engines might still look at the path name string and consider if that's more or less relevant for their search results. So certain filters might just need to be put into the path name instead or additionally to the query string. If you want to write it to local storage, maybe that's going to be useful. And I actually would recommend not using model objects for all this stuff, because model objects as JavaScript classes, especially on a website like this where you need to server-side render it, and you use like we do, like a Next.js or something for that, these objects you can't transfer from the server to the client. Like the class information gets lost. You have to sort of put them to JSON and then read them back from JSON and recreate the class on the front end, which is a bit of a hassle. To user setting, right? You save it in your preferences on the back end in Supabase or wherever. And sometimes, or most often, to tracking data, because you sort of want to know in a third-party app somewhere on what are users actually doing on your website and which filters are they applying. And it's another serialization that you just need to do. So whenever you deal with filters, you actually have a lot of different serializations you have to do, and then the same problem backwards. How do you read from all of these things, right? So this would be an order that could be relevant. where you say like, first try it from query string, and if that doesn't return anything, try the path name, and if that doesn't return anything, then try the user setting, and if that doesn't return anything, then read it from local storage, and if that doesn't return anything, have a decent default. And that default, again, could be informed by where's the user from, where's the user visiting from, which market did they actually open, based on other information. So you can make like decent guesses on what the user actually wants. But all of that, a lot of work. And all of that, if you didn't expect that complexity initially, very hard and makes me really, So coming back then, I mean, web is just hard. The whole talk is just sort of trying to make you appreciate the complexity that we're working with as developers. And I'll share the slides later, and I hope some of these slides you can sort of use as a checklist. Whenever you do something complicated and you have an ambitious project that has a lot of moving parts to it, you can open it and see like which of those should I consider right away, which of those could I potentially do later, add on, work with in another way, maybe go around for a while until eventually we pick it up. At least do it knowingly, that you can sort of estimate the amount of work that you have to put in later on. Adding an internationalization library at the very end, it's often very hard, actually a lot of work. So you might want to sort of have it established already so you can attach it later if you know it's going to come at some point. Saves you a lot of work. So all these things, use it as a checklist to make sure you have thought about everything at least for a minute, and then go about to implement your work. Because most issues in web products stem from a disregard of the actual complexity we have to deal with. It's sort of always very easy until it's not, right? That's how the whole technical debt builds up, and like you end up with really nasty solutions sometimes, no matter how good the framework was that you started out with, and sometimes even no matter how experienced you were starting out, if you didn't have the time to do it or took a minute to think about it. So respect the complexity, and web development is your friend. Give in, don't find it. The complexity is large, but it is definitely finite. Thank you very much.